Today, I have the great honour of speaking with Imelda Maher. And Imelda is the Sutherland Full Professor of European Law, a former UCD Dean of Law, and a member of the Royal Irish Academy. And today, we will chat about consentification and treaties, when are constitutions not enough? Hi, Imelda. How are you today?
Hi, Tricia. Good to see you.
Great to see you too, and thank you so much for joining us. And my first question for you today, Imelda, is where are you located and what's been keeping you going over the last few months?
Well, I'm in UCD at the moment. I live in Dublin. Through the arduous last 18 months, Dublin's been great because it's near the sea and we're near the mountains. And I'm lucky that the family has kind of got along okay, and the dog has survived despite being told he wouldn't survive much longer, so he's still with us. So the hinterland sustains me professionally, I think it's fair to say, and great colleagues as well.
Fantastic, Imelda. So, Imelda, you are the Sutherland Full Professor of European Law at UCD, and you're also the former Dean of Law. Can you please tell our audience about these roles and what makes you so passionate about what you do?
Well, it's nice to be on sabbatical. I feel immensely privileged to have the opportunity to go back and engage in research where you really need sustained, quiet time in order to work through your ideas, and in our case, at least in law, to get lots of reading done. And one of the things I'm struck by being on sabbatical is how intense the teaching experience has been in the last 18 months again. But what I've taken from that also is that that intensity translates now into the classroom, where it's very welcome. And I suppose one of the things I'm most passionate about and looking forward to re-engaging with is more teaching. I managed to keep it going while Dean to a small degree, but it's wonderful to be able to engage with students, hear their ideas, meet with them and sustain them and intellectually as they progress through their degrees here.
Wonderful, Imelda. So moving on to your title today, Imelda, Consentification and Treaties, when are constitutions not enough? Maybe you could tell our audience more about this, please.
Yes, and this is a project I've been working on for a few years now with my long-standing collaborator, Dermot Hodson, who's Professor of Politics in Birkbeck College in the University of London. And we're interested in this question of how difficult or how easy it is, or should it be, to change the EU treaties. As you know, it happens periodically. We're acutely aware of it in Ireland, because the number of referendums we have around the issue. Around the time of the last fiscal crisis, there was talk of treaty revision, but there was an appreciation as well that it is getting more difficult. I think the last round of treaty consents there were 44 parliamentary chambers involved, and that's before you get to the referendums or indeed the court's challenges. So it is more complicated, but complexity in itself is not necessarily a bad thing. And I suppose what we interrogate and we want people to reflect on, especially politicians, is you may need these consent processes in order to embed the EU more thoroughly and more securely at the national level. In other words, you need to legitimate the overarching documents, which are the treaties, for the states that are involved. Okay,
and I'm sure our audience will have a lot of questions around that. So please do remember to submit your questions via the chat function. And then the last question for you now, Imelda, before we open it up to the audience, is in UCD Discovery, we are incredibly passionate about interdisciplinarity. And I'm just wondering, how important is interdisciplinarity to your work?
Well, all my research, I'm interested in law and governance of the EU. So law and governance, by definition, tells you I'm right at the margins of law, which is an uncomfortable place to be, but it's actually a very exciting place to be as well. And what I'm really passionate about is trying to unpack what is often, to me, looks like the black box of law in other disciplines. There's an assumption you feed a policy into this black box and it'll come out in an unproblematic fashion on the other side. When in fact, what emerges is something that requires interpretation. That's why we've got a court system. It requires implementation. That's why we have regulators, agencies, police forces on the criminal side. And it's also there to negotiate disputes. You know, we really need our legal order to help us resolve differences between people in a civilized manner. And I like to take that to other disciplines so that they can engage with me and we can extrapolate and explore the ideas that I have around law to see how they will play out in other domains.
Great. Wow. And I have so many questions for you. So I hope our audience, please do submit the questions, and they're already coming in thick and fast. Here's an interesting one. I hope I pronounced the name properly, but it's just bear with me for a second, Imelda, while I read it. So mathematician Kurt Gödel, I hope I pronounced that properly, famously found a loophole in the American Constitution, a flaw that would allow American democracy to be turned into a dictatorship. Are some constitutions flawed to some degree?
Well, yes. If the nature of democracy, and there are others better placed to discuss this than my good self, but democracy, if you like, is the least worst political system that we've got. But also democracy, there is always the risk of the tyranny of the majority, and that's why we have to have counterweights in order to balance the idea of just pure majority rule. We have to protect our minorities, and actually, that's what the law is there to do. It's not just ruled by the majority; it's ruled by the law. And that's important. And it ensures then those that are in power are also accountable. Accountability is really important, I think, for political actors, that they have to explain what they do, giving reasons. So these are simple ideas, but their impact on our politics and our society are profound.
Okay. And there's a question about the Irish Constitution now, basically saying, since the beginning of the Irish Constitution, when it came into effect in 1937, there have been 32 amendments. And it's basically asking whether this modern constitution bears little resemblance to the original one. Will there come a time when modern constitutions bear little resemblance to the original defined constitution?
Who knows? But it's a great question, because I'm interested in what lies behind it. To what extent should constitutions retain a bedrock of consistency across time? I think that's what the question's getting at. I think we do need some consistency for our foundational documents. And we do need, people need to feel secure that they have a sense of the overarching framework of the law, because that reflects the society in which we live. At the same time, you do need this capacity to change as well, because constitutions can become outdated. And in fact, one of the criticisms of the EU, if I can go back to the EU treaties, is that there's been too much change over a relatively short period of time. And I think that has a destabilizing effect as well.
Okay, and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions around the EU, because that's your speciality. But here's a really interesting one. So, not being a lawyer, could you comment on the suggestion that, in inverted commas, democracies and constitutions only work when the people want them to work?
Like, ultimately, it's the people who give the consent to others to rule them. So ultimately, it resides with the people, the extent to which people they can be ruled within a democratic context. It's different if you're talking about autocracies or dictatorships, where the consent of the people is replaced by force, ruled by law as opposed to rule of law. So you do need the consent. Like the classic model is the people give their consent, and often articulated through the vote in order to be ruled on a representative basis. Okay.
So that actually, there's so many questions here. I'm just trying to keep it to. So this is a really interesting one, and it's I expected something like this around Brexit, or basically the Anglo-Irish relations or the Northern Ireland Protocol. But here we go. It is commonly said that the UK has no constitution. Now that Britain has withdrawn from the EU, which does have a constitution, is the British system an unprotected one? And could that potentially impact Anglo-Irish relations?
You really need your British constitutional lawyers here, but I know what we say is that the British constitution is not written down, in the sense it's not contained in a single document like the Irish constitution is. That doesn't mean it doesn't have certain constitutional rules or conventions that can be invoked. And the key principle within the UK context is the sovereignty of Parliament. So I think the question is, so that's the constitutional part of the question. And then the EU famously does not have a constitution in the sense that the European constitutional document was rejected and dropped following a no vote by the French and the Dutch some years ago. But the treaties are what we could call, this is real legalese, it's real academic line, but to say that it's a constitutionalizing political entity. So it's has constitutional elements, but not a formal written constitution. It's still based on treaties, in other words. I think then ultimately the question is, again, it's going back to this notion of the rule of law. Is the UK, does it still embrace and be subject to the rule of law? I certainly hope it is, as our nearest neighbour. And I know there have been problems around the internal market bill when they sought to depart from legal obligations at the international level, but they were dropped following severe opposition from the House of Lords, which was heartening.
Okay, so EU now. So there's a lot of questions around EU, which I know is more your area. So just find one up here. And actually you touched upon this in terms of the EU having treaties. So what are some of the greatest treaty conflicts in modern Europe, and how did constitutional laws compound those conflicts?
Ooh, I wouldn't know where to even start with this question. Well, we have, like, you have some, things can become, I think what we need to think about is, who's the famous politician who said is, you watch for the small things because they're the ones that trip you up. So for example, something like the Dutch referendum in 2016 on the EU-Ukraine association agreement. Association agreements are fairly routine, mainly trade-related agreements. But in the Dutch context, there was an opportunity under a law that has since been repealed for citizens to look for a referendum. So they sought, there was a popular vote to have a referendum on that particular agreement, and it was voted down. And the context of that was the downing of a Malaysian aircraft over Ukrainian airspace, where you had nearly 200 Dutch citizens killed. But the political context was that there are a number of Eurosceptic civil groups in the Netherlands who were looking for an opportunity to generate referenda around Europe. So, something fairly technical kind of blew up into a fairly big political issue.
Yeah, absolutely. I never knew that, actually. So this is an interesting one, and it's around, I suppose, the Conference of the Future of Europe. But it's do you see, which I'm sure you want to speak about too, but do you see the EU surviving in its current form long term? And there's a second question, or will East-West cultural differences, for example, Poland, and North-South economic differences tear it apart?
Or will it die gently?
Yeah, exactly.
It doesn't have an army at the moment, anyway. Will it continue in its current form? It's sometimes I think it's difficult for us to appreciate the extent to which it's consensus-based, the EU, because it tends to only come to popular attention around when there's major treaty changes, and then contentious issues are rightly debated. But generally, it operates on a consensus model. So that would suggest that it has capacity to continue. Now, there is a big debate going on at the moment around what we call differentiated integration, which would allow certain member states who were enthusiastic about a particular policy to deepen their engagement on it so they couldn't be vetoed, if you like, by those who were less keen. And I think and the third element of that question, so, that can happen at the moment. It's a bit clunky. It's not engaged with as much as it might be, but their expectation is that might happen more often in the future. The risk of that, of course, is that you get this different kinds of Europe in different places, and how would that work from a legal perspective, for example, is a difficult question. And the third element there is around Poland. Every member state that signs up to the EU signs up to the rule of law, and there are major questions, as you're probably aware, around alignment with the rule of law in Poland at the moment, in particular in relation to the independence of their judiciary. And I don't think the idea of a member state looking to stay in the EU while not necessarily embracing all EU values was ever really considered at the time of the various treaty revisions. So it provided a very new context. And one of the difficulties has been that the EU didn't really have the tools to tackle it. That's now changing because there's been a plethora of case law from the European Court, and now there's been a link to the purse. When law didn't talk very effectively and politics wasn't working, there's now recourse to what we call treasure, or the law, or money. So it's still going to play out, and play out with difficulty. Whether Poland is a model for everywhere else in Europe, I think it's more an outlier. Hungary perhaps being a close second.
And just in your point of view, there's another question around, I suppose, and it ties in perfectly with that. Constitutionally, what's the largest threat to the EU, the future of the EU?
I think is having an agreement around values is very important. And while I think this conference on the future of Europe it's hard to pinpoint what it really is about. On the other hand, I think anything that allows us to address the values that underpin Europe, whatever language you speak, whether you live, at the farthest eastern end or the western end, in our case, I think that's a debate that we really need to have. Because if people can have, and I don't think you have to have a really finely grained understanding of something like accountability or the rule of law in order to know that that is something that matters. And if that matters to you at the individual level, at the level of citizen, as well as the level of the state, I think that underpins then what can happen at the European level.
That's a wonderful way to finish, Imelda, and we're almost completely out of time, but I have to ask you, and I have to tell our audience, that not only are you a member of the Royal Irish Academy, but you are an Honorary Bencher of the Middle Temple Inn of Court, London. And I would, in 30 seconds, maybe you could tell our audience what that means.
Well, there's 4 Inns of Court in London, and there's one here in Dublin as well. And when you become a barrister, you become a member of the Inn of Court, because originally they were inns where people lived in order to practice law. Now they're professional bodies, if you like, but also have a long tradition of dining. What's wonderful about being an honorary bencher is it's honorary. It doesn't carry any duties, but I get the opportunity occasionally to go over, and it's a wonderful historic space. The church dates from 1215, when it was rebuilt post the Second War, but parts of they expect that Magna Carta was negotiated in part within the church, so it has very long-standing legal roots indeed.
And as an Irish female academic, it's an incredible honour for you to be part of that, and it's just wonderful. And I had to say it before we finished up, but we are unfortunately completely out of time. So sincere apologies to all of you whose questions I didn't get to, but I want to take this opportunity to say an absolutely huge thanks to Imelda for the most fascinating discussion today. Thank you so much, Imelda.
Thanks, Patricia. Thanks, everybody.
And thanks to everyone for joining in. And don't forget, you can sign up at zoomforthought.ie, where you can check out our list of upcoming speakers. So thanks so much, everyone, and see you all next on Zoom for Thought. Thanks, Emile. Bye.
Bye-bye.